Hi, I'm Shale the Folk Herbalist, and welcome to our synopsis of the March Reads. Welcome to my first ever YouTube video. And I can't imagine a better way to kind of kick off this channel than talking about something that I love, which is books. And so if you are joining us from over on TikTok or Instagram, you'll know that I have set a goal for myself as a way to increase my knowledge and as a way to deepen into my practice as an herbalist and as a folk witch, by challenging myself to read one herbal book and one witchy book a month. And part of this too is that I tend to be a bit of a book hoarder in that I love to buy books but don't actually end up reading them. And so I have a pretty extensive library. Not to say that I won't continue to contribute to it, of course, because a girl's gonna keep buying books. But what I am going to do is use this as an opportunity to kind of cut down on how many books I have in my library. So let's get into it. The herbal book for March is The Land in Our Bones by Layla Feghali. If it will focus, there we go. Just look at how beautiful this book is. Yay! I obviously adored this book. I mean, just look at all of the tabs. Granted, any of the yellow ones are actually plant profiles, which this book was very rich in, and I'll get to that in a second. But even then, you can just see that I very much enjoyed this book. Also, I've become a bit of like a book talk girly where you have tabs. I don't know why I didn't do this before this book, but I am going to continue to do it moving forward. I love it. I love being able to retain my knowledge a little bit better. I do have notes, so I will be looking down every now and then to give a quick synopsis of this book. It was just so gorgeous. I loved it so much. I can't wait to discuss it more here, but this book discusses the indigenous cultural roots and earth-based practices, rituals, and ways of life and relationships to herbalism of people of the Crossroads region of Canaan. And in case you're wondering what that is referencing, Feghali describes the Crossroads region of Canaan as the ancestral civilization that originated in the areas between Syria and the Sinai region of Egypt, everywhere west of the Jordan River, making up the physical borderlands between the African and Asian continents. I very much appreciated the unapologetic look that this book really takes on the concept of colonialism and the fact that it has this really deep ripple effect, and the outcome of this is really the disconnection of place from people from the land that they are from, but also on ancestral lineages as well. And what's really beautiful about The Land in Our Bones is it really dives into the idea that by living in reciprocal relationship with the earth, which means that we are living in such a way that we are in attunement with the seasons and that we are giving back to the earth just as much as we take. It's not this like constant process of extraction and oppression upon the earth. It's really a way of living in alignment with the earth's rhythms and living in partnership and stewardship. And really what's beautiful about this book is it really looks at how living in this reciprocal way and connecting to the plants is a way of remembering and reconnecting to our ancestry and being able to reconnect to our heritage and to find healing in that which has been disconnected and severed. And in this book, she uses the term plant cesters, which I have just absolutely fallen in love with that term, and really witnessing the plants and the herbs as guides and teachers and members of our lineage outside of human lineage and blood lineage. These plants are interwoven into our lineage just as much as our great-great-grandparents and ancestors and those who have walked before us. And so this book really dives into the concept of plant cesters helping us in the process of remembering, so re-membering, which is another beautiful term. And also throughout this whole book, there's a lot of intentional use of language. She actually even has a meaningful language glossary in the back that she asks you to reference before even starting the book, because her choice of language is very intentional and woven in such a beautiful way. But I would like to reference what she means by remembrance or plancestral remembrance, in that it's a concept that is being reclaimed in diasporic and displaced cultures in the West that refers to the decolonization of identity and the restoration of connection to one's indigenous origin, which includes one's relationship with the land, spiritual practices, culture, and one's people prior to colonization. In this book, she also goes farther into exploring how deep the wound of colonization can go, in that it's not necessarily just responsible for displacement of people and disconnection of people, but also is a source of degradation to our natural land and to ecological systems. So the examples that Feghali uses in this book is the example of European pine trees that have been introduced into Lebanon, or eucalyptus plants in occupied Palestine. So these are plants that are not native to the land and have become extreme disruptors of the ecosystems and were introduced by people who are not from the land. And we can witness this happening in the United States. There are so many invasive species that have been introduced here that largely came from European colonizers. And on the flip side, there's also been the eradication of native plants that were sacred or utilized here in the United States by indigenous communities for food and medicine, that have now become endangered or non-existent or no longer able to be accessed by the indigenous people who tended to them and revered them. A great example of this includes white sage. So this is a plant that is deeply sacred to indigenous communities of here on Turtle Island, which is also known as the United States or the Americas. And this is a plant that was deeply sacred for ceremony and ritual as a smoke cleansing herb, but has since been over-harvested and over-consumed and commodified by people who do not have a relationship to the plant. And this also, so not only has this increased the inability for indigenous communities to access it, but this also comes after decades, if not centuries, of oppression of indigenous ways of spirituality and practice, and demonization of it, to where the indigenous communities were not even allowed to participate in these practices. And now it's seen as this like witchy, exciting thing, and this spiritual practice that is so openly used, which is really just insulting to indigenous communities that had such a long-standing relationship with this plant, were severed from being able to use the plant, and now have to fight for access to it with people who do not have a long-standing relationship to this plant. And I do want to acknowledge that as somebody who identifies as an herbalist of European descent, that the discussion around colonialism is a tender one, and one that should be approached with a lot of intention and humility. And especially as somebody who was born and lives upon occupied land here in the United States. But I think that's why this is so important for us to have these types of conversations and read books like this one and be able to challenge our knowledge of herbalism and even of medicine, especially in the Western world, and quote Western herbalism, because so much of what we understand and what forms the roots of Western herbalism and Western medicine actually comes from places like the Crossroads region of Canaan or Asia and Africa. And a lot of this information and knowledge has been whitewashed, and these histories have been erased. And there is not an acknowledgement of the ways in which people of these lands and ancestries have contributed to or had their knowledge stolen from to build the foundation for what we know today in our herbal and medicinal practices. Additionally, while my ancestral lineage is not from the region that's described in this book, the discussion in this book further emphasized something really beautiful that has been passed down to me by my teachers and something that I hold very sacred, in that it is so important to work with the plants and the herbs of our ancestors and what our ancestors would have known. So in my lineage, I descend from both colonizers and people who were colonized in Europe. And so for me, this is a little bit twofold. First of all, there's a lot of collective grief for not only me. I know this is not something that my lineage alone has experienced, but there's a lot of collective grief for people living in the United States in particular who are of European descent, because there was a lot of our ancestors that were either forced to or believed that they had to give up their ancestral traditions and beliefs and culture in order to assimilate and survive in the United States. And so again, this idea of working with the plant ancestors of my ancestral tradition is twofold. The first is that it is a way of taking accountability for the colonization that exists in my lineage by making sure that when I am aware of the impact of colonization, especially as it relates to my relationship with plants, that I am, by working with plants in my ancestral tradition, I am avoiding perpetuating harm by not appropriating plants that do not belong to me or to my heritage. And then on the other side of this conversation, I really want to allude to what Feghali says in her book that she is sharing from her teacher Hakim, which is that to know our ancestors is to know ourselves, and to immerse in their land is to realize their memory. And so I'm going to read a few additional quotes from this book on the relationship to plant ancestors and how they can help us restore that which has been lost or severed in our ancestral connections. So the first is that plants of place and origin are an interwoven part of these understated worlds that mend and make belonging. They, like our ancestors, have adapted to the challenges of lifetimes, embedding wayfinding intelligence inside of us. When we are lost or have forgotten, they have the power to re-member us. They wake up the ancestral lifelines inside of us. And the second quote is, our ancestral plants knew us so intimately. In fact, their mere presence in our lives can retrieve parts of us so deeply buried that we do not even know they are amiss. They record the taken and untold memories of our ancestors and their embedded wisdoms too, because they are part of the source that created and inspired them since the beginning of time. Our plant ancestors of lineage are such a foundational part of our cultures and legacies of knowledge, affection, and survival that we would not be who we are without them. And so something else that my teachers have passed on to me is the idea that plants work with us not only physically, but energetically. And they have the ability to work with us in realms that are both unseen and seen, and also work with us in the realms of time and space in a way that we just can't fully comprehend or understand. And so by working with the plants of our ancestral lineage, we are actually restoring to these ripple effects of time and connection back farther than we can even imagine, in ways that we may not even understand. And there's this way of working with the plants in modern times that reconnects us back to those who were walking the land and tending the land before us, and helps us to reconnect energetically and spiritually to places we may feel disconnected from. So a few last points on this book that I'll mention is that I had similar feelings reading this book that I did to reading Braiding Sweetgrass. And if anyone has read that book, it also really dives into a lot of the concepts around what it means to belong, what it means to be connected to place, and what it means to be a true steward of the land. And I also just really appreciated the beautiful stories and connections to culture and heritage that were in this book that Feghali shares so intimately with us and in such a heartfelt and an intentional way. Also, the plant profiles, if you can hear my cat, I apologize. He is making an entrance. Hello, Jesk. Also, the plant profiles in this book, which again, I've tabbed all of them, are so deeply rich and so woven, or mythology and storytelling and connection to memories that Feghali has in her home villages in Lebanon and other places in the Crossroads region are just so intimately woven in these plant profiles, along with medicinal and culinary properties of the plants themselves. And so it's just such a rich look at the plants themselves. And I will end by saying that I just adored this book. This is one that I'm going to return to again and again. And I also think it's one of those books that has actually become one that I would recommend to, one of my top books that I would recommend to anyone who is wanting to cultivate a relationship with the plants or is maybe starting on an herbalism journey, because I just genuinely feel that anyone who wants to walk the plant path needs to understand the plants on a deeper level than just what they can be used for. It's a journey of learning how to live in reciprocity with the earth, how to live in attunement with the earth's rhythms, and how to cultivate a deeper connection to nature, as well as understanding what it means to be connected to place. And so this is another book, along with other books like Braiding Sweetgrass, that I would highly recommend as building that foundation for your journey with plants before you even ever start working with them. So highly recommend this book. I loved it so much, and thank you, Layla, for sharing just such an intimate and beautiful and rich piece of literature with us. I'm just so grateful and feel so honored to even be able to read these words. That's how deeply I feel about this book. So now moving on to the witchy book from March, and unfortunately I don't have a physical copy of it because I read it on my Kindle, but we read The Crooked Path by Kelden. And to give kind of a quick synopsis of this book, it's one that covers a very specific lineage of witchcraft practice, known as traditional witchcraft. And the practitioners that follow this path call it the crooked path. And so this book provides a pretty foundational overview of what traditional witchcraft is and how to participate in it. It also incorporates so many exercises, rituals, spells, tools, and just foundational knowledge to anyone who might be interested in participating in this practice. So what is traditional witchcraft? Traditional witchcraft is an umbrella term that describes a vast array of many non-Wiccan traditions and practices that are inspired by folklore. And there are three key focuses of traditional witchcraft. The first being working with magic that is steeped in tradition and folklore, of course. The second is working with nature and having a connection to the land. And the third is working with spirits, both here in the physical realm and in the other world. Some of us might also describe the other world as the other side, or what lies beyond the veil. It's a very similar concept in traditional witchcraft. It is also a practice that gleams from historical witch trials. And what I mean by that is that it really gleams from what was documented during the trials, as far as confessions from victims of the trials themselves. And while it's important to acknowledge that a lot of these quote-unquote confessions that came from people who were accused of witchcraft were really coerced or brought about by torture or these just unfathomable acts that is hard for us to even wrap our mind around happening in our modern times. But where this kind of reconstruction happens is by reviewing what these confessions said. It's really looking deeper at the thread from which they originate. So what is the folklore that victims might have drawn from in these confessions? Because it's that goes deeper and is older. And that is where we are finding this sort of reconstruction for modern rituals and spells and practices. And also in traditional witchcraft, this is where we see the presence of a lot of things we might kind of stereotypically associate with witches, such as their connections to the spirits of the land and those who have passed on, as well as the concept of working with familiars and familiar spirits, and also things like curses and hexes, and of course folk magic. So what I really appreciated about this book was the wealth of exercises, spells, rituals, all of the things that were incorporated into this book. They're woven into essentially every single chapter. Some of them have more than one, and they're just really rich and easy to follow, and there's a lot that I will probably continue to reference in my own practice and return to. I also really appreciated the writing style in this book. It was very approachable and easy to understand, and it was also very comprehensive while also being foundational and straightforward, and just allowed for the ability to build a strong foundation in traditional witchcraft and our understanding of it, while also leaving room to go deeper for any area that interests you or that you would like to kind of scratch more under the surface. So I wanted to also kind of discuss some things I found personally intriguing about traditional witchcraft and my relationship to it as somebody who is a folk practitioner. I resonated a lot actually with this path, especially being somebody who considers themselves a folk witch. And of course, the fact that this path is really rooted in folklore and tradition is highly appealing to me. And it feels like there's a sense of connection to ancestry in that regard as well. While I resonated with a lot that's involved in this practice as somebody who identifies as a folk witch or folk practitioner, I can't say that after reading it I would necessarily identify as a traditional witch or bring that label upon myself. But that being said, there's so much that I found very intriguing about the crooked path. And the first one is really the concept of hedge crossing. So to talk more about hedge crossing, the practice of flying on a broom, or that stereotypical image that so many of us are really familiar with when it comes to witches and witchcraft, actually has its roots in the practice of hedge crossing. And so the way that witches would go about doing this is that they would utilize flying ointments, which were balms or salves that were really made from plants that were sometimes toxic or had entheogenic properties, meaning it helped them to kind of shift realities and shift perspective and cross more easily into the other world. And also what is interesting about the term hedge crossing is the fact that for many cultures of this time, what was beyond the hedge was what was considered scary or mysterious or unknown or outside the confines and security of our civilization. And this is something that the witch really embodies, that which is wild, that which is unknown, that which is not confined to societal norms. And so this became a symbol that witches would utilize. Once you cross the hedge is when you would move from this world into the other world. And so hedge crossing is really allowing one's spiritual self to disconnect from your physical body and actually move into or go beyond the veil into the other world to be able to commune with spirits. And it's here that witches have the ability to download information that may not be available here in our physical realms, or to conduct stronger spells or methods of healing that may not be available to us in this dimension. I also, of course, deeply resonated with the connection to nature, in particular the land spirits, but what I really appreciated was the bioregionalism concept in traditional witchcraft, which means this connection to the land that you are on and the place in which you live. So often we find ourselves wanting to connect with exotic plants from faraway lands, or plants that we don't have an ancestral connection to. We just kind of alluded to this earlier in our conversation around the plant cesters with the land in our bones. But traditional witchcraft really emphasizes the power and magic of the plants and the land spirits in the land that we are on, and the importance of getting to know them and to incorporate them into our craft. And therefore, practitioners of traditional witchcraft it's gonna look a little bit different for everyone around the world, because your relationship to the land is different, and the plants and the land spirits and the animals that are around you are very different, and there's a richness to that. And of course, I appreciate the simplicity of practice in traditional witchcraft. It really leans into folk magic, which is also known as the magic of the people. This is what our ancestors would have turned to for things like remedies or healing or protection or calling in abundance, all of the things. So things like, incorporating specific herbs into chicken noodle soup when we're sick, that's considered a form of folk magic or folk practice that so many of us don't even realize has roots in that way, but has been passed down and passed down and passed down because it's something that was vital to our ancestors. Lastly, I was intrigued by the concept of the witch's devil. Hear me out. So, before you all go all satanic panic on me, I wanted to talk about this a little bit more deeply. So this book really describes how in traditional witchcraft there is this concept of the witch mother and the witch father, which are really just archetypes for divine masculine and divine feminine, which is pretty prevalent in a lot of forms of spirituality or religion even. And in traditional witchcraft, this idea of the witch father is also synonymous with the folkloric devil. So again, before you go all satanic panic on me, I promise that there's deeper meaning to this. The devil in folklore is something that is more symbolic of, again, the wild, of nature. And it's this embodiment of the kind of deeper, darker recesses of human psyche. So things that have often been, no pun intended, but demonized or dubbed evil by more kind of controlling systems, if you will. So things like speaking one's truth, or liberation, or wildness, sensuality, many of the things that often women in particular, if I dare say, were oppressed from being able to participate in or embody in a lot of ways. That being said, while I find this archetype intriguing, I do not personally resonate with wanting to venerate or work with the concept of the folkloric devil, even if he's not necessarily connected to the concept of like the biblical devil. It's just not something that I feel like in my personal practice I resonate with as much as I tend to resonate with the concepts of just general divine feminine and divine masculinity in my personal practice. And so I thought I would round this out by joining in on some of the really great reflection questions that Kelden has in the back of this book. Once you go through the whole journey and the whole path alongside of him, he gives you the opportunity to really reflect on what traditional witchcraft means to you and how you might incorporate it into your own practice. And so I figured it'd be just kind of fun to reflect out loud some of my responses to some of these questions. So the first question is, did I have a preconceived notion about traditional witchcraft? And after reading this book, how has it changed? I guess I will say that I didn't have a whole lot of knowledge around what traditional witchcraft is. And for some reason, I thought it would be a little bit more structured, kind of similar to things like Wicca or the more kind of high magic or ceremonial magic type traditions. It wasn't until I came across other practitioners in the community that really resonated with this book, that have that deep connection to things like tradition and folklore and ancestry, connection to nature, that I was like, oh, maybe there's a bit of a different connection to this path. And so it was something that I felt curious about and wanted to dive into. So I would say that my preconceived notions definitely did change, and I found that I resonated with it a lot more than I actually previously probably intended to or thought I would. The second question is, who are the ancestors you wish to honor and work with in your craft? So I think this is a question that I tend to reflect on quite a bit, but the way that I define the ancestors that I want to work with are those that are the well ancestors. So those are the ancestors beyond our known ancestry. Like, they are the ones where their names have been forgotten or lost to history, and they go back beyond pre-colonial times, in times when we lived in deep reciprocity with the land, and the more animistic type ancestors, because I feel like there's so much that we can learn from in our modern times by working with these ancestors. That doesn't mean that I don't also want to work with ancestors that are closer in time to mine, or those that are remembered ancestors as well. Those are definitely deeply important to me. But there's something about going back into the far recesses of time that I think has such a powerful, that has just such power in restoring our ancestral lineages. And the other ancestors that I am curious about working with, of course, are the plant cestors, like those that we mentioned in the previous book, With the Land in Our Bones, and plant spirits and plant spirit guides that have been known throughout history, but also spirits of place and spirits of the lands that my ancestry comes from, the spirits of the land upon which I occupy. I think it's important to acknowledge and venerate the ancestors of those who stewarded the land before colonizers came. And in this case, I am on the lands of the Arapaho Ute and Cheyenne here in Colorado. I think working with animal ancestors is also important. Also, I did resonate with I can't think of the concept off of the top of my head, but there was also the concept of working with ancestors who had contributions to the practices that we know today. So people who have contributed to our understanding of witchcraft or our understanding of spirituality, and also venerating them as well and recognizing their contributions to what we know today. And the last question that I really liked, and I really enjoyed this concept that as it was discussed in the book, was how can you personalize and adapt folk spells and charms to fit the modern context of your life? I think there's a lot of folk charms that have the ability to really have a lot of resonance in our modern times, but perhaps we are in a situation where I don't have access to those plants because they're ones that exist in Europe, where I have native plants that I'm working with here. And so I think the ability to adapt to place is really important. Also thinking about things like flying ointment, for example, there's a lot of that might not really resonate in today's times, like the fact that so many of the plants were baneful plants or toxic plants, and perhaps there's ways of weaving in consciousness shifting plants like mugwort, for example, that helps us get into that state of trance or being able to pass between realms, but doesn't necessarily have toxic elements, and working and modifying things like that to our modern times. Or thinking about adapting charms to our modern technology. So for example, when we're thinking about protection workings, that might have applied to just protecting oneself from energies in your community back in the day, but our communities are so much broader now. For example, there is a lot of negativity that can exist on the internet, and so how we can adapt folk charms and perhaps the things that we wear upon ourselves in videos like this to be able to protect ourselves from unwanted energy or negative energy that we may experience from people who come across videos like this one. And so there you have it. There are the reviews for the 2 books for March. If you are curious about following along on this series and want to participate with each of the books of the month that are designated, again, we are doing 1 herbal book and 1 witchy book per month. Be sure to follow me on Instagram or TikTok or both, and that is where I will be announcing the books each month. So thank you so much for being here. If you're still sticking around after this long video, I'm grateful for you being here, and please subscribe if you'd like to join the party more. Blessed be.